The first lesson wasn't very successful from a cultural point of view because the primer was one of those that starts with A stands for aardvark. What the hell is an aardvark? Said Ed. Why not teach me words I know, like A stands for ale? What's this next letter? Mr. Pope said it was B. Oh, that's an easy one, said Ed. B stands for beer. And what's this? C, said Mr. Pope. C stands for scotch. Said Ed. No, Ed, said Mr. Pope. C stands for, let me see, cognac. Well, this didn't make sense to Ed, and Mr. Pope tried to explain, and they got into an argument that lasted until it was so dark that they couldn't see the letters anymore. The bottle was empty, too. Ed was persistent, and he had Mr. Pope nail the primer up over the manger, and in a week he could read "The cat chases the rat as well as you or I can." Then Mr. Pope brought out an old school reader, and Ed went to work on that. But after he'd got through the third selection, he struck. "This stuff is too darn noble, Wilbur," he said. "I can get all the edification I need out of your conversation. Bring me something a little low." So Mr. Pope got copies of a few of the more ribald magazines, and as a slight corrective to these, he brought out The Three Musketeers. Ed simply ate them up. In the manger, Mr. Pope had rigged up a reading light, which was small enough so that Mrs. Pope couldn't see it from the house, and the horse read far into the night. He got very clever at turning the pages with his nose, and for the first few months he would hardly stop reading long enough to speak to Mr. Pope except to demand more books. But before long he had read all the adventure stories and even some of the more serious novels in the house. Mr. Pope wouldn't get him any more magazines with jokes or risque stories in them because twice Ed had got to roaring with laughter in the middle of the night, and Mrs. Pope had sent Mr. Pope out to the barn to see if it was tramps. So then Mr. Pope got Ed a card at the public library. So 2 or 3 nights a week they would ride over to the library and get a couple of books. Of course, Mr. Pope had to go in and pick them out, and Ed didn't always like his selections. "That's all right, Ed," said Mr. Pope, "but you can't read detective and adventure stories all the time. Some of your reading ought to be to improve your mind." "Listen, Wilbur," said Ed, "I'm a horse." What good is an improved mind in a stable? Get me a good Western to read tonight, will you? Well, along in the early fall, Mr. Pope had to go to Detroit to present a new radio plan to one of his accounts. He got some library books and some detective story magazines for Ed, and he hired Joe, the handyman, to take care of the horse while he was away. And the first thing Joe did was to find Ed's library and tell Mrs. Pope about it. "Books in the barn?" said Mrs. Pope, and she went out to look them over. "Good heavens, what trash," she said. "Throw those magazines out at once, Joe. And these books seem to be some Mr. Pope got from the library. You'd better take them back." So Joe took them back. Well, Ed stuck it out without literature for 2 days. On the third evening, as soon as it got dark, he slipped his halter, and by cutting across lots and down back roads, reached the library unobserved just before closing time. He peeked in a window. Nobody was there but Miss Sigsbee, the librarian. Ed pushed the front door open with his nose and clumped up to the desk. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said.